Welcome to Awareness to Action, a podcast brought to you by the Northwestern Community Services Board Prevention Department. I'm your host, Casey, a social worker and prevention specialist here in Virginia. Our podcast goal is to promote wellness through conversation, connection, and action. We hope each episode will leave you feeling inspired and motivated to look for ways to get involved in your own community. Hi everyone, welcome back to Awareness to Action. Today I'm joined by Keith Cartwright. Keith is a behavioral health wellness consultant for the Virginia Department of Behavioral Health and Developmental Services. In this role, he leads the statewide initiative to grow awareness in communities about the developmental impacts of adverse childhood experiences. Keith also works part-time as the Alcohol and Drug Education Coordinator at Randolph-Macon College. Keith and I covered a lot in our conversation, from adverse childhood experiences to the difference between prevention and promotion. And perhaps most importantly, we talked about how to build better relationships, something that feels more relevant now than ever before. I hope you'll enjoy listening to this conversation as much as we enjoyed having it. We recorded amidst the pandemic, so Keith is joining me via Zoom. Keith, welcome to Awareness to Action. I'm so happy to have you here on the podcast.
It is good to be here. Thank you.
Let's just start with you telling our listeners about the roles you're in now and the path that brought you here.
Oh boy. So my full-time role professionally is I work for the Department of Behavioral Health and Developmental Services, long title. And what I do is I help manage federal substance abuse prevention funds that go out to the 40 community service boards across the state, one of them being Northwestern. And so I just help make sure we've got good substance abuse prevention plans in place, that we're using our money in a good way. Then I also work part-time at Randolph-Macon College. I'm the Alcohol and Drug Education Coordinator there. Also a lot in the prevention world. And prior to that, I spent 13 years working with at-risk kids in a residential wilderness program. And at the time, I didn't really know that it was all preparing me for this life I'm kind of in now, but it has. And, you know, our conversation will probably speak to that as we work through it.
It's pretty amazing how all of the pieces fit together eventually to bring you exactly where you're supposed to be.
Absolutely. I'm a big believer in that.
So, Keith, ACES is a science, a concept, what would you call it? What would you call ACES?
I would call, definitely it starts with a science, but I think for me, it has sort of migrated from a science into philosophy. It certainly has a spiritual component to it for me. And again, maybe some of that will make sense as we dive into it. But ACES basically says that scientifically, numbers wise, that a lot of us have experienced hard things in our life. And really the earlier we've experienced those, the more impact it potentially has on us. And sort of from a philosophical and spiritual standpoint, I think knowing that challenges us in our daily interactions to at least consider, if not start with, the idea that, I'm talking with Casey right now, and there's a really good chance that Casey has had something hard in her life happen that shaped this person that I'm talking with today. And I just think that's a great thing to kind of understand about each other, especially in a world where we spend a lot of time trying to put on these masks and costumes that say we have it all together, when we start at a place where we can recognize that we don't have it all together. There's some freedom, I think, that comes with that. So I don't think that part's scientific, but there's a science that backs it up.
Yeah, I like a science and a philosophy feels right to me.
Right.
So this science philosophy is really important to you. And in a minute, I'm going to ask you to really define ACEs for our listeners. But for now, I'd love for you to tell me how ACEs were brought to your attention and why they mean so much to you now.
Yeah, so it was, I guess, 4 years ago. I've been doing this substance abuse prevention work for a long time, especially if you factor in the early years of counseling. It's all kind of tied together. And most of that has been targeting, preventing folks from using, abusing substances in a harmful way. And 4 years ago, I was sitting in this place of, this professional life where, as a country, we were in the middle of a suicide epidemic and a drug overdose epidemic, both of them the worst epidemics we've ever had in our lifetimes. And so if you're a prevention guy, that's kind of your scorecard. And the scorecard is, man, we're not doing something right here. Everything we're trying to prevent, people are doing more of and suffering more from it than they ever have. And it was about that same time, I was at a big prevention conference we go to every year up in Washington. And I'd been to it several years. And it's one of those multi-day conferences, and they have breakout sessions. And is the afternoon, and it was like, well, I don't really feel like going to a breakout session. I've been to all of these, but there was one, like it just kind of jumped off the page at me. It was ACES, Adverse Childhood Experiences. And I'm like, well, I've never heard of that, never been to that. So let me do the responsible thing. I will go to a breakout session, and this one's one I've never been to. So I'm going to this one. And long story short, it was an hour and a half breakout session, but I walked out of that training knowing that my life had been changed. I couldn't put my finger on how, but you just get these feelings, something's really different. And, at the crux of the training was this gentleman who delivered the training was the assistant district attorney of a town in Massachusetts, which I can't even remember the name, but at that time, they were second in the country in opiate overdose deaths. Statistic you don't want to be number 2 in the country in. But this guy talked about how he had ended up in a training on adverse childhood experiences, which really talks about, what experiencing adversity, challenges in early in childhood, what that does to your long-term health and, future in many ways. And he said he couldn't help but think when he heard this training about all of his officers who were showing up in these houses where a mom or a dad or a caregiver was overdosed and dead in the house. And then on the other side, in a corner somewhere, are these little kids crying, distraught from what is happening there. And he said, at the time, the process would be somebody would show up, take the kids away, and he would never really know what happened with these kids. And this training he got really made him start thinking about this in a different way, understanding the impact and what was happening, not in just those kids' lives in general, but really in the development, this is the science piece, and the development of their brains, and their biology was changing. And if there wasn't some sort of intervention to help them deal with that in a healthy way, they were suddenly at really great risk of not just that moment impacting them, but it carrying through, their entire life. So he went back and put some different things in place in his community. I left that workshop listening to this man, and I went back to my boss and I said, this is a couple of days later, but I told her, this prevention work we're doing, if we do not include this conversation around adverse childhood experiences, if we don't include that in the prevention work, at the very best case scenario is we're leaving something really critical out. Worst case scenario is we're doing everything all wrong. And I probably lean, after 4 years of being involved in this, probably lean more towards the latter, that we were really doing a lot of stuff wrong by not having this work as the foundation of what we're doing, to state level in prevention and certainly in our local communities.
So now that we have set the stage of adverse childhood experiences, knowledge being incredible and life-changing and, truly a game changer, I'm going to challenge you to summarize this huge concept of ACEs for our listeners in just a few minutes, if you're up for the challenge.
Yeah, there's people who've heard me talk about ACEs that are laughing right now. They're saying this dude can't describe anything in 3 minutes. But, really just the science of it is, as, Casey, you and I, we came into this world as babies and our brains were like nothing, right? We came with just enough brain wires to sort of instinctually trigger these things inside us that we needed as babies. We needed our heart to beat. We needed our lungs to breathe. We needed something to trigger hunger so we could cry out to see if somebody's going to come feed us. But we didn't need a lot of connections to say, what time do I set the alarm clock? What time's dinner tonight? That's just not who we are as babies. We come with these very primitive brains. Our brains develop in response to experiences. So obviously between the ages of 0 and 3 years old, there's a lot of new experiences happening in a child's life. And that young brain develops in one of two worlds. One world is they instinctually have all these needs. Mom or primary caregiver is showing up to take care of those. So that brain is being wired to anticipate, life's going to be cool, right? There's always going to be somebody here taking care of me. It's going to be safe. The other world a brain develops in is one that anticipates danger, hostility, chaos, neglect. And so that brain gets wired to anticipate that things are going to go wrong. It gets wired to anticipate it's time for me to run. It's time for me to fight. It's time for me to hide from these things. The problem in that second scenario is the brain is under a lot of stress. And our brain is wired in a way when it's stressed to send hormones and chemicals into the body to do certain things to help aid in stress. Wants the heartbeat to speed up, wants the lungs to breathe a little bit faster, wants to get that immune system engaged in case there's some sort of attack that requires healing. And we're all kind of wired for about 20 minutes of that stress at a time, just enough time for us all to kind of figure out, do I need to fight this thing, hide, run, and then for it all to kind of come back to normal. The problem is if somebody grows up in an environment, and especially in those most critical years of their brain developing, certainly 0 to 3 is when there's just rapid growth. Science would tell us our brain is not fully developed until we're probably in our mid-20s. But certainly the earlier, the more dangerous it is to have these chemicals constantly firing into your body. Number one, it's going to kill off some brain cells that might develop that you'll need when you reach adolescence and adulthood. They're programmed to develop then. Well, then lo and behold, you get there one day and they're not there. And somebody say, well, what happened? And it's potentially something that happened long ago. And then the other thing is if your heart is constantly being triggered to beat, right? Eventually that thing's going to burn out. And so that's why folks who experience something really early in life may be at an increased risk already for heart disease down the road. So I don't know if that was 3 minutes or not, but that's about as close as I can get it, man.
We'll count it. I think what's so profound about utilizing ACEs as a lens is how holistic it is. I mean, you're truly looking at the body, the brain, and the person as one incredible, complicated unit. Yeah. And allowing that to impact work is just, again, a game changer. And yeah, hearing you speak about it is really incredible.
Yeah, well, and I say all the time, we all are wired for the same thing. Our bodies, every one of us, you, me, everybody we interact with today, as different as we all are, we're all wired for one thing, and that's to stay alive, right? And so we've all got these sort of systems inside the body, constantly reading what's going on outside the body and adapting all that in this really complex but beautiful and sort of miraculous way that's real time, right? Just constantly processing this information in a way that keeps us surviving. And it's an amazing sort of machine we all walk around with, which I don't think we often think about the complexity of it.
Yeah, we're We're a lot. We're a lot going on at all times.
That's right.
So many systems are a go.
That's right.
I think it is helpful when we stop and think about that. And even, I mean, this knowledge is applied to our work, and you and I will talk more about how we can apply it in our relationships, but it's really applicable to ourselves too. I mean, how often are we really taking the time to stop and think when we're experiencing whatever sort of feeling to say, okay, there's a lot happening right now.
Right.
I have got physiological systems going. Yeah. I'm experiencing the world around me. I mean, I don't do that. I just get mad, and then I'm like, well, I'm mad.
Right.
I'm not taking into account all the factors.
And it's beautifully put. I mean, that's exactly what it is. And when you understand more about how your body works, you do have a lot more control over. And emotions are, a lot of times our biggest enemy, right? And that's because we're constantly responding to some stresses that maybe trigger us to run when we really don't need to, or fight when we don't need to, or hide when we don't need to. And when you learn to, no, wait a minute, let's pause a minute. Like you just perfectly said, just consider all that's going on. Maybe there's a potential to calm down here and, avoid some things that are avoidable.
That's a perfect segue into what I want to talk about next, which is the difference between reactivity and prevention in the context of ACEs. We love prevention here. I say it in every episode, so sorry to our listeners, but we really love it. And I want to hear about how that applies to ACEs.
Yeah. So I would say for the most part, our public health model is built on this idea that we do not want people to die. And I always say, I'm a big fan of that. I'm a big fan of this idea that we don't want people to die. But the problem with that is that too many times we fail to act until somebody looks like they're about to die. And so I always use this example, like heart disease, people who die of heart disease. Like if somebody has a heart attack, that's when we're kind of like all in on saving their life. But the reality is there are some levels below that heart attack where we have an opportunity to prevent it, right? So I always use heart disease as an example. Well, there's a lot of people we know that get heart disease from smoking cigarettes. So we want to prevent heart disease. Maybe we can get better at preventing people from smoking cigarettes. Well, somebody who digs too much into the research of smoking cigarettes will discover that a lot of people smoke cigarettes because they're depressed. There's a lot of mental health issues that the nicotine is absolutely helpful in calming some of the impacts of the mental health challenges people have. So now we're like, people dying of heart disease, we're already down to this level of people suffering from depression. Well, what's led to that? Where did this depression struggle come from? And that's where we start getting into, well, maybe there was some things that got rewired in their brain along the way. And maybe that rewiring happened in response to things that happened in their childhood. And then, there are so many layers even beneath that. So why did this young person experience this adversity in their childhood? Well, there's a really, really good chance it's because the people raising them experienced adverse childhood experience. There's this transgenerational sort of passing of this adversity. And that's scientific as well, right? Genetically, this adversity we face in our lives can be passed on to a young person in the form of which DNA gets read and what doesn't get read from generation to generation. The stress we face as adults can actually be passed down. And again, that's more than a 3-minute conversation. But as we get down to these layers, we start to see opportunities to intervene and get involved long before. We started with somebody who died of a heart attack, right? Now we're all the way down to like my mom and dad and what they experienced in their childhood. And once you start to believe that impact, and that is ACEs, right? Suddenly your you should be a little bit motivated to try to help heart attack way before it happens. And, if your heart doesn't get into that, like, I just care about these people. I want to prevent that stuff. You have to start looking at this thing from a fiscal standpoint then. The amount of money we spend on healthcare that could be prevented if we addressed some of the impacts of adverse childhood experiences much earlier. Just the fiscal piece that would save us in this country, you can't even begin to measure it.
And as you're talking about all of that, I'm thinking about how at surface level, it sounds like it would be easier to just respond to the heart attack. But, it sounds complicated here. You talk about peeling back all of those layers and going back. It's like, how could we even approach that? But we know that it's possible, and we know that it is better in the long term if we're addressing it, going back and looking at those layers so that we can address it in the future.
Yeah. And well, it'd be a much longer podcast maybe, but the problem is that, what people need early in that sort of preventative place, is they need people getting involved in their lives. And, for whatever reason, too often we're inclined to, well, let somebody else deal with that. And we do that. We pass that on until it's doctors dealing with a heart attack. And some of that is that a lot of us don't understand the impact we truly can make on lives early on if we get involved.
And I think that what you've just said is a difference between the reactivity versus prevention mindset. Is reactivity, it's a small group of specialists really who
Yes.
are addressing the problem. But if we're taking a preventative approach, it's everyone. It's a collaborative,
That's right.
community approach of professionals and individuals and personal lives, which is really, to me, a lot more beautiful than a small group of
Right.
specialists.
Right. No, and I say all the time, I had this conversation with a group just a little while ago. They asked me, and maybe this is the wrong thing to say on your podcast, you can edit it out, but since we're talking about prevention, but we've done a lot of work at the state level and changing our narrative and what is prevention and how do we talk about that in communities. And we had this brainstorming session a few years ago, and some of our consultants asked, well, thinking outside the box, what is it that you would change about prevention? Like if you could just do anything. And, I thought about it for a little bit. I'm with my whole prevention team, and I want to say this, but I'm not sure it's a great thing to say here, but I'm going to say it anyway. I said, I think we should get rid of the word prevention. And like everybody, like, what are you saying here? But see, to me, prevention is about me and you, Casey, and your community. What do we need to do to prevent this person, stop this person from doing this or that harmful behavior? It's all a very defensive thing. The word I would replace it with is promotion. What do I need to promote in this person's life that will help minimize the risk of some of these things I'm going to want to stop down the road? And that's where your community example comes in. Like, what as a community can we do to promote the wellness? And that takes substances out of it too. This is like, I'm wanting to promote the overall wellness. And if you factor ACEs into it, I want to promote the overall wellness in this young person and family's life at the most critical point in their life. Because we absolutely know if we promote some of the right things at that time, the risk of some of these things we want to prevent down the road gets reduced drastically. So, I know we talk about prevention on here, but like a lot of the work I think in communities has to evolve to what do we want people to stop doing, to what is it as a community we want to help promote people to start doing, and what part of that start can I play? because a lot of people aren't going to start doing something different unless they have a meaningful relationship or a meaningful partnership with somebody else. So it's a we thing. Too often prevention's let me help you stop this thing.
Yeah, I can get on board with promotion over prevention. I like that.
Nice. Yeah.
I mean, yeah, because exactly what you said about prevention can feel defensive when it's really the concept of prevention, and if you're translating that to promotion, is so strengths based. It's let's get the best of our community and the best of what's inside of you, and let's work together and make that what we're focused on and bring that into the future. And
absolutely.
Well, part of the prevention/promotion side of this is making sure that young people have as many protective factors as possible. So first, can you define what a protective factor is?
Yeah, and it's funny. I was thinking as we were having that conversation, really what we're wanting to promote in young people's lives and people's lives are protective factors. And, risk factor is like, if I have this thing in my life, too much of it, and we talked about ACEs, if there's too much stress in my life, that becomes very risky. Protective factors say that if I have enough loving relationships in my life, I'm going to be protected from a lot of this long-term risk. And if my family is employed, or if my family has access to healthcare, those are protective factors against some of this stress that a young person might feel in the most critical points of their life. Some people's faith communities, that's a protective factor. So protective factors, I just define, if I have enough of these things in my life, they're going to, just having them in my life is going to reduce whatever impact of these risks that we might talk about. And there's kind of, we talk about ACEs in terms of, the original ACE study revealed that the more of, and they looked at 10 adversities, and they found that the more of these adversities you experience in childhood, the more likely, if you experience more, you're more likely to experience adverse health outcomes down the road. Well, the reverse is true as well. If you look at protective factors, the more of these protective factors you have in your life, the less likely it is that you're going to have these adverse health outcomes down the road. And it gets into that whole prevent, right? Am I going to prevent all of these risky things from happening? Or am I going to work as a community to promote all of these protective factors that we know are going to insulate this child and this family from the potential risk that we're talking about here today?
And what's exciting to me about protective factors are that they're perpetually relevant. Protective factors aren't just something that matter for young people.
That's right.
They matter always, and the impact of them is long lasting. So they matter for everyone, but they really matter for youth. We know that. So how do we make sure that youth are supported, and what age group should we be thinking of when we're talking about ACEs?
Well, certainly the science, as we talk about that brain development, the most critical phase is that 0 to 3 years old. And again, that's just because there is so much happening. By the time a young person goes to elementary school, they have more brain connections than they're ever going to have, because there's another process that starts happening after elementary school where the brain, because, we talked earlier about how complex this whole system is. Well, the brain recognizes that. And so what the brain wants to do is automate as many processes as possible in our life, right? And like walking, you and I are going to walk today, and we're not going to walk left foot, right foot. Our brain has automated that whole process, and it wants to restore it wants to hold as much energy possible for this higher level thinking. So you and I can think about, what's my answer going to be on this podcast? All these work things we have to do. All of that to say that a lot of these wires are being formed from 0 to 3 or 4 years old, up to that elementary school. Beyond that, then the brain starts taking a look at all these wires that have developed and saying, this one's a waste of energy, this one's a waste of energy, and it starts plucking them away. So all you're really left with are these wires you use the most. And going back to our earlier conversation, you either have wires that are wired to anticipate life's going to be okay, or you got all these wires in there that are anticipating something dangerous, chaotic, something I need to run or hide from is going to come. Those are the wires you have. And so it's really critical in those earliest days of a child's life to get as many of those major life's going to be good, I feel safe highways in place, because the older you get, it's harder to rewire the brain. Like I'm at an age now, like, I want to go back to elementary school and refire and rewire some of those things. But it's like for me to develop a new habit or a new wire, I mean, I've got to be ultra focused on one thing, hour after hour after hour. Little kids, like they see it, boom, wire, like, and you just watch a kid learning to walk and you get that. It's like one step and then the next thing they're running around the stinking living room. So that's earlier and that 0 to 3 age is where I say that's if I had to pick, if I only had one age group to pour all resources into, that would be it.
Which is amazing, because I don't think that that's what comes to mind when we talk about supporting young people. We don't think of the people who are so young.
No. And I just had a conversation a little bit ago. I've talked about my progression through prevention, and that progression was, first, it used to be solely centered on how do we keep people from smoking weed, drinking alcohol, overdosing, all of those sort of specific drug related things. And then, a lot of my attention would go to these college age students. Like these kids are coming here, they're cutting free, they're abusing alcohol, doing drugs and doing all this stuff in a really risky way. And then I sort of got down the road and I thought, well, you know what? They're picking all this stuff up in high school. There's a lot of stuff happening in high school that they're bringing with them. And then I worked my way back. Like, well, middle school is such a transitional time. There's changes going on, hormones. It's a whole new education system. That's where they're picking up this stuff. And today, I'm at new mamas, new babies. That interaction, that period is, if you want to define like the riskiest formation period in a kid's life when it comes to future, not just substance abuse risk. Now ACES tell it's not just that. It's mental health disorder. It's risk of suicide. It's unemployment. It's days where you just don't feel like doing life. It's heart disease. It's cancer. It's asthma. It's any health outcome you can think of. Dr. Anda, who trained me on a lot of this, said that adverse childhood experience is the greatest predictor of public health outcomes we've ever had. And the first time I heard him say that, I'm like, okay, well, that's a nice little brandy, commercially thing to say. I'm already bought into the training. I don't need to hear it. Now I believe that at least as much as he does. Like, I absolutely believe if we could get to moms, babies, and do everything we can to make sure that they have the opportunity to build these loving and safe connections that help a brain and a baby wire to anticipate and thrive in those things, we'd work miracles on the healthcare system. I mean, it would be miraculous what would happen.
And so for a miracle to happen there, I think we need to expand where that support's coming from, because we think of 0 to 3-year-old humans, we think of the support as coming solely from the parents or the families. So how do we shift that into a community-based approach?
Yeah, I mean, that, and Casey, that's a beautiful way to frame that, because that is, like, we think of family, we think of those 4, 5, 6 people inside that house, right? Well, let's step back then and look inside that house through this science. And if we believe, like I do, and hopefully some listeners now, if we grow to believe that what the science tells us and what I just told you, that the most critical time in preventing or promoting long-term health, good health, happens between 0 and 3 years old, between a baby and mama and primary caregiver. And the best chance of that being a period that promotes long-term health is having as little stress in that interaction as possible. Now, anybody's had a kid knows there's going to be stress, and not all stress is bad stress. If a baby is stressed and there's somebody there helping them deal with that in a good way, that's what we want, because we want a baby to be able to tolerate more and more stress as they grow. They get conditioned, but they get conditioned by somebody showing up in stress, helping them manage it in a healthy way. That cannot happen if the primary caregiver that's going to respond is dealing with their own stress, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so if we're a community like just peeking outside that house, inside the windows, and we're invested, we know this, we believe this. So our goal right now is we're going to make that as stress-free as possible. Then we have to start asking ourselves, what are the things that might contribute to the stress in there? Well, to me, the big one that always comes to mind, and it's, to me, it's one of the things that puts us on such an uneven playing field, certainly in our communities and across this country, is poverty. If I'm a mom who has to worry about whether I'm even going to be able to feed my kids tonight, that's a stress that doesn't go away. It ain't like after lunch, it goes away, because now I'm worried about dinner and breakfast the next day. So poverty is one of those huge issues a community can sit and say, okay, do they have the means to have a stress-free environment? And then that has other layers to it. Access to healthcare is usually a side product of poverty or income. Access to a good quality education, right? And a lot of our communities, the poor are going to poor schools and poor education, and they're missing out on the opportunity to work their way out of that poverty. Some of the things we've dealt with this summer take on a different sort of meaning. When you look at, systemic structural racism over time, or any sort of oppression in a community, if I'm a mom or a primary caregiver, dealing with some of this stuff and worrying about some of this that's gone on in my life through the generations, I'm pretty stressed about the likelihood this is going to impact this baby I now have, or babies. So it really, as a community, it's looking inside that house, realizing sort of my community job as a loving, caring, invested community member, interested in the whole health of the whole community, is looking in there and saying, okay, science tells me, and I now know this is a really critical time in that baby and mama's life. What mitigates the chances of this turning really unhealthy is stress. So how do we, reduce some of that stress? And that requires us, that requires us to be empathetic. It requires us to take a deeper understanding, because too many times it's, well, I've overcome stress in my life, they ought to, toughen up and overcome it in their life. It's sort of the easy and wrong way out. And so it requires us to, walk in somebody else's shoes, like truly walk in them. And, I could get real preachy on all of this one. So it's prevention, not preachy, but, I think there is a lot to think about there as communities.
Yeah, I mean, I'm so glad that you brought that up, because we've talked plenty in this conversation about the scientific component of ACEs, but there's a cultural component there as well that is, I'm not an expert enough to be judging whether the scientific component is more important than the cultural, but I would say the cultural is as important, if not more important, to what this means in our communities. And you're just making me think. I had a professor in college who all the time would say, pie, pie, pie. When you're looking at people, think of pie, and it's person and environment. We can't look at a person without taking those sociocultural factors into consideration. And we do a disservice when we're blind to those.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. going back to your, science or culture or, to me, we can be very philosophical, spiritual, cultural about this notion that, a lot of notions where we kind of are our brother's keeper, or that, this whole idea of empathy, right? That for community to truly thrive, I have to be at least as interested in Casey's well-being as my own. Now, those are sort of things that are, a lot of people would say that's sort of philosophical or spiritual, or you're getting all culturally or whatever, The science proves it, right? That's the beauty of this. I don't think it is. To me, the bigger part is just sort of how do we interact with one another as humans? And there's always been sort of this, whether whether it's part of your faith or whether it just makes sense to you, this whole golden rule, treat people like you want to be treated. Well, if you can't buy into that, the science is telling us, right? If we don't treat people, especially early in life, like we would want to be treated early in life, science tells us the outcomes are not going to be as favorable as they would be if we treat the baby and treat that family and give them the opportunities and the outcomes, at least the opportunity to have them, as we would want for ourselves. So to me, that's the beauty of this. And it's why I constantly call it, the science of empathy. I've always been a big believer in empathy. I've always think, if empathy was the driving force of the way we navigated life with each other, things would be a lot better off. But that's sort of just Keith speak and Keith philosophy. But no, this is the science that says that, the science that proves that. So
we can't really go wrong by adding more empathy into the mix. There's not really a way for that to go south, I don't think.
We try, we try to take it out, but no, the answer always comes back to that. Again, I say about adverse childhood experiences, when you look at the original study, there's 10 areas of adversity that they looked at. But, I say the one thing all 10 of those have in common is they serve to at least really, really damage, and in many cases sever, the relationship between a baby and the most meaningful person in their life at that time. That's really what they all have in common. Well, the solution to that is the same thing. The solution to that is a meaningful relationship with somebody at the right time in your life. You can't get away from, the impact of our interconnectedness. We literally, wherever you believe that came from, we were literally wired to be connected with one another. And the better we are connected in a healthy way, the healthier life goes for people scientifically, and the more those connections get broken and relationships aren't healthy, we know that's a risky deal.
So we're meant to have these healthy relationships. We have the capacity for them. Then let me ask you, what stops us? What gets in our way? What are the barriers to creating and maintaining and investing in those relationships?
Well, I'm going to poke at some people out there. And before I poke at them, I'll say I'm poking at me too. We're not good at relationships, really. And this isn't folks who've suffered adversity. This is all of us are not really good at adversity. And I'll talk about me, early in my work as a counselor. I say the first year that I was a counselor, I was the world's worst counselor ever. Like that first year, you can throw any awful counselor at me. They were not worse than I was working with kids that first year. And I will say it's because of this. For that first year, I thought what all those troubled kids needed, I thought the answer to all of their troubles was a little more me. They just needed to hear a little more about my life. They needed to hear a little bit about my story. They needed to hear a little more how hard I worked in school, how hard I worked on the athletic field. They needed to hear, boy, what my mom and dad would have done if I'd have done that in your shoe. They needed to hear all about Keith. Every problem they had in their life was a problem because they didn't have enough Keith in their life. And so I was going to give it to them. And, after a year of that, I discovered most kids had more problems after dealing with me. I got called every name in the book, and so did my mom and anybody close to my life. Like, I could take a crisis and make it 10 times worse. Somewhere along the line, though, now that I've raised my hand and confessed to being the world's worst counselor, I got to tell you, I became a really, really good one. And it's because I figured something out. Those kids didn't need more of me. They needed me to hear more about them. There was this real tangible healing that started once I learned to just let kids start talking about the struggles that they had faced in their life. I remember a kid one day getting, just as angry as a kid could get. I mean, and it turned physical. There was all sorts of just ugly stuff happening. And then we all got back together, and I don't know what triggered it. To me, it was like this divine sort of words got put in my mouth, because they weren't words I would have ever said. Somehow they came out of my mouth. I looked at this kid and I asked him, what are you so mad about? Because you can't be this mad at me. I've never done anything to you in your life for you to be this mad at me. And, he didn't respond to that right away. He cussed a little more and fussed and just threatened, what those kids did. And then he kind of calmed down. And he looked at me and he said, do you really want to know why I'm so mad? And I kind of calmly, because he's like serious. There's a new look in this kid's eye. And I said, yeah, I really want to know. And that boy took a finger and he pointed it right at me. And he said, you have no idea what it's like to grow up without a dad. And I was like, I just stood there. I had no idea what to say. Number one, because he was right. I didn't have a clue, right? I grew up and dad was always there. I had grandfathers, I had no idea what that was like. And the thing, when I said that to that kid, you're right. I don't. Tell me about it. And so then it wasn't even as much that dad wasn't there. I mean, it was watching a mom who had to run the family all on her own. It was about him, 13 years old, having to be 18 years old, trying to take care. I learned that day. I didn't know it. I look back now and it makes more sense to me. I look back then and knew that was the key to building a meaningful relationship. You don't need more of me. I want to know more about you. And, we've got social media. We've got a lot of platforms now that encourage us to tell all about us, right? We got a lot of avenues that invite us to give my opinion, right? Give my advice. And what we know, again, from adverse childhood experiences, and I just think from a humanity standpoint, and I'm an adult now, and I think most adults listening know when we get stressed or when we get sad or when we get upset, the thing we want most is just somebody who'll listen to it, right? And not somebody to fix it, just somebody who's going to listen. So this thing I'm feeling, this was a kid for 13 years. This anger he had, he thought it was fake. Everybody had always convinced him that he shouldn't be mad, that he had no reason to be mad, that he should just get over it, that he should just suck it up. I was the first person in this kid's life. And like I said, I don't even take credit for it. I don't even know why, but I was the first person who said, tell me about it. And that suddenly made it real. We don't have enough people walking around in this world saying, Casey, tell me about it, right? And when people start to tell us about it, we want to cut them off and say, oh, I can fix that for you, Casey. You don't have to go any further. I got this one. And that's hard. People out there are in marriages that are saying, oh yeah, man, that's a hard deal. It's hard with our kids, right? We're raising kids and we want to just jump in, say, stop, knock it off, put things back together. Those kids just need to tell you what's broken, what needs to be put back together. So that's a big one to me, but to me, it's the answer. That is so much of the problem and solution we have for a lot of challenges in our lives. So relationships, we're not very good at them. That's and that's an area. But the beautiful thing is, I tell people, this is an easy one to fix. Just shut up, right? That's all we got to do. We just got to shut up a little bit. When we walk by somebody in the hallway at work and say, hey, how was your night? Like, at least stop to listen for the answer. We go by, good morning, how was your night? And before even anybody thinks, we're settled down, turning our computer on. We got to stop these superficial conversations, these superficial interactions, and start getting real. And, people get scared by the word, but vulnerable, with one another, because those are the stories we most want somebody to hear, and they're the stories we're spending all of our time covering up. And because we don't feel like we can share them, they stay in here, they produce stress. We pass that stress on to other people in our life, and we got a stressed out world that isn't very good at relationships. So there you go.
So that's it.
I didn't,
easy peasy.
Yeah, I didn't keep that one under 3 minutes. I know that.
But Keith, that's everything that you just said is so important. And I have 1 million thoughts pinging around in my head. But the first is that what I hear often, people identifying as a barrier to building meaningful relationships with people who have had different lives than them, is how can I understand where they're coming from? I don't have any of the same experiences, thoughts and fears along those lines. Well, yeah, if I show up and it's the Casey show and I'm only sharing my own stuff, I'm only projecting my own stuff, of course I can't relate. Of course, right. Because I'm just putting more of me out there. And so it just makes a lot of sense that in order to connect with a life experience that's different than ours, that we don't know anything about, we have to pause and we have to listen. Yeah. And I think with that, there's patience that's needed. Yeah. You mentioned social media, and I was thinking about, I kind of roll my eyes when people say this because you hear it so often, but it's true that we live in this fast-paced world where everything's instant. And I think sometimes we expect our relationships to be that way, but what good relationship has been fully formed in minutes? I can think of none. Right. And I think sometimes we don't give it time to build up to that vulnerability. We don't give it time for the expressions of care to come out. We give it a little chance, and then we say, well, I don't know, it didn't really turn into anything. I'm moving on.
Right. No, and I think you're right. I say it all the time. We are a snapshot society. So I'm sitting here looking at Casey. You got on this nice purple shirt that I talked about. And so, it's easier for me to just make a judgment about who you are, what you do, like right now. And 100% of the time, I'm going to be wrong about that because there's a deeper story to you. Now I can get some impressions but we want to take the fast way. And the fast way is just to kind of have a brief sort of snapshot judgment or interaction. And that's not worked out for us. We watch our news with the same lens, right? We see these characters on the news and all that's going wrong in the world. And man, we just fire off our judgments and thinking about that without any sort of deeper thought about what are the stories in these people's lives. Now, we don't have the time clearly to do that with everybody in our life. But man, we got to have some of them. We're going to have some of those relationships in our life. And, I would say the younger we are, especially with our kids, they surely need to be surrounded by those relationships in their life.
Yeah. And I think, we can't, as you just said, those deeply meaningful relationships. We're not meant to have those with every single person, but we're meant to have meaningful connections with the people around us, which is why I'm really glad that you mentioned earlier building those connections with coworkers. I mean, a coworker is someone you spend 40 hours a week with.
Right.
And
that's right.
And how many of us we have coworkers that we don't know that much about because we don't stop and ask. We really don't stop and listen once we ask. And I think, hearing you talk about this, I'm thinking of the importance of this in our homes, but in our workplaces, in our schools, in our communities. So, I mean, can you speak a little bit to that on this broader scale?
Well, I mean, to me, it's just, it is just taking relationships to this broader scale. If we're ever going to help people understand the importance of relationships, some of us have to start taking the lead in forming those, right? And the workplace is a great environment. How do we all work best together if we don't even know one another? Too many times we look at, like, sports teams as a good example, and these guys spend a whole season they get to know one another. I forget what coach it was. I thought, man, this was just beautiful. It was on one of these pregame football stories not long ago. It was a new coach, and he'd taken over one of these teams, and they did well. I wish I could remember which team it was. But very first day of practice, when he pulled this whole team together, you got 70, 80 guys in there. He started the practice by saying, I want every one of you to tell me the hardest thing you've ever been through. And so each guy, and to hear it, just the stories that came out of that, and this went on for hours, right? And well, what a perfect thing. Like, how many of us are willing to do that? Like, how many of us are willing to say, Casey, I want you to tell me the hardest thing that ever happened to you? And there's two common reasons why I would not do that and why we don't do it with one another. And I don't know which one's the most common, and that's clearly my opinion. But one of those reasons is, well, if I ask her that, this could take like an hour. Like, if she starts telling me about the hardest thing in her life, this could end up being a long conversation. And I got to go run, or I got to go, do this or that. I got to go get Netflix on. I don't want to sit here an hour. The other thing is, well, this could be scary. Like, if I'm asking somebody the hardest thing they've ever been through, they could bring up some stuff that may be hard to hear. And I would just say two things to both of those. Number one, maybe it's just me, but I'm not sure where there's a better place to invest our time than in one another. And like I said, I go back, I worked for 13 years. The number of kids who reach out to me today, and that is the beautiful thing about social media, and say, you saved my life. And I'm like, well, that's kind of over the top. But I joke all the time, well, tell me what I did to save your life, because I'm going to write a book, like how to save people's lives. I mean, I'll make millions. But all of those kids, they all answer it in different ways, but it's always one answer. You were there. No matter how hard things were, you were there. And I'm like, well, did I say something brilliant? It's like, no, you were just there. And so that's the other thing, I think the other thing is, when we feel this pressure of, oh my God, Casey's going to unload this big thing and I won't know what to do about it or how to help her. You already have. Casey don't want you to fix it. Casey just wants you to hear it. And we put so much pressure on ourselves, like we have to have the answer to everything. Well, number one, get over yourself, because you don't have many good answers. So you're just throwing stuff out there. I mean, I learned that with these kids. Like, I thought I was brilliant. Like, no, I didn't have one answer that worked for them until they knew I was interested in what they had to say. Then I was suddenly brilliant. Then everything I said made sense, because they knew I cared about them. They knew that what they had to say was more important than me. So culturally, whether it's in our workplace, whether it's in, too many families, I mean, not too many families in a living room don't have this environment. And I don't know how, I don't know how, other than one connection at a time. I don't know how we fix that. I just know it starts with more quiet, right? More listening. I made my boys sit through an online church service a couple Sundays ago, and the whole thing was, and I keep repeating it to them just to mess with them, like they were bored through the whole thing. But the whole scripture was about, slow to speak, quick to listen. And so I'll mess with them now. It's like, hey, are you being slow to speak? Are you being quick to listen? But it's true, so science, scripture, whatever, none of it works wherever you are. Like I said, with those young kids, I wasn't quoting the scripture and I wasn't speaking science. I listened and watched lives change. And the science is, they to this day will call and say, you saved my life. And the only thing I did was shut up and listen when they were having a really hard time.
And a piece of that you touched on is removing this idea that there's a list of qualifications that we have to ask questions and to listen. We're so wrong when we think, well, I'm not going to have the perfect response, so I can't ask, or I'm not that social of a person, so these relationships aren't for me. This is for introverts. This is for extroverts.
Yeah.
This is for every human to be working on. And it makes me sad to think about people not having the kind of connections they could have because they think that they don't have what it takes. I feel like we do inherently have what it takes, and we can build upon that to make our ability to build relationships even better.
Yeah, and we're talking about adverse childhood experiences here, but there's a book that came out recently, Vivek Murthy. He was the Surgeon General in the Obama administration. And so this is a guy, he was our Surgeon General. This is a guy who has studied a lot of pandemics, a lot of public health issues. He wrote this book to say the greatest health risk we have right now is loneliness, right? And so he wrote a whole book on loneliness, a lot of research in it. But it all boils down to this, what we just talked about. People are suffering from loneliness, not because there are a lot of lonely people out there that have, I read this book and I went on Facebook and I'm like, I got 2,000 friends, but like, I don't know which one of them, like if I had this really hard thing going on, like which of those 2,000 is it? That's problematic. And so this idea that, and it skews our thinking. We see all these people have all these connections and have a hard time believing, well, surely they can't be lonely. Well, lonely isn't a quantity thing. Lonely is a quality connection thing. And that's what we're talking about. Quality connection is, who is it that's going to come and just sit and listen, right? Come sit and listen without feeling overwhelmed by obligation or overwhelmed by fix it. So again, the science supports all this as well. When we start talking about we're bad at relationships, our connections aren't strong. Well, here's the Surgeon General of the United States who spent 3 years researching and says the greatest, health epidemic that we have going on right now is loneliness. And it's only magnified right now in a time where we are, kept from one another, where we have a hard time doing this and being in each other's lives in a meaningful way. So we got to be creative on how you do that. We might have to do something crazy, like get on the phone and talk to one another, or Zoom and do these things.
So
that's my relationship sermon, Casey.
Well, I appreciate it. And here is my optimistic take, my brief.
Yeah.
Not a sermon, just a thought on the idea that we have a loneliness epidemic is, okay, so we all want meaningful connections. We all want relationships. So when I feel scared or intimidated by the vulnerability that
Yeah.
making that connection requires, I can remember this other person wants this
That's right.
too, because we're made for this. So I just, to anyone listening and to Keith and to myself, let that be a reminder that
Yes.
these relationships are worth pursuing, and we're made for it. I don't
That's
know
right.
any other way to say it than that.
Yeah. No, and that's perfect. I mean, that's a really, really beautiful reminder because that is why we hesitate. It's like, am I being weak? Well, only as weak as the person you're about to talk to, because we are all craving that same thing. It's whether, we're either lying about it or we're craving it,
Yeah. And we have this unique time in history to be creative about it and if there's ever a time to put yourself out there and try to make a connection, I feel like it's right now, because we all need it more than we ever have.
Absolutely.
This has just been incredible, Keith. I'm so grateful that you're here and having this conversation with me and for all of our people listening. If someone's listening and they're feeling fired up and ready to get engaged with the work of ACES or with the idea of building relationships within a community, what resources would you recommend for continuing to build on that awareness? Do you have some learning resources that have helped you in your path and might help someone else?
Well, there's a couple of learning resources. Anybody who wants to know more about ACEs, I would highly recommend you listening to the Nadine Burke Harris TED Talk. I wrote the name of it down. How childhood trauma affects health across the lifetime. When I went to look up, because I watched this TED Talk years ago, and I was like, holy moly. It was shortly after I had my experience. And I think it's been viewed like 8 million times. So I would go look up Nadine Burke Harris, childhood trauma. There's another book I read, Lost Connections, and it's by Johann Hari, Johannhari. And it really sort of marries this idea of adverse childhood experiences with this conversation you and I just spent some really good time on in terms of relationships. It, once again, gets heavy science into the importance of those connections. Those are, there are tons of books out there. If you Google ACEs, adverse childhood experiences, you'll get reading material and viewing material forever. I would start with those two. And then in terms of, getting involved, a lot of our communities have started to develop what we call these trauma-informed community networks. And, these networks really get together and they talk about these different areas that I work in my sector of the community. How do I do things differently through this lens of what we've talked about on this podcast? And those are really, really powerful coalitions, because one of the things that, I'll go out and do a presentation, have this conversation, and people say, the light bulb will go on, there'll be this awakening, and then tell me what to do next. And tell you what to do next is different, like for what a school should do, what a church should do, what a Department of Social Service should do. So what it requires is a group of people to get together who are passionate about this and put that lens on that we've kind of given them today and take a look at their community and say, what are some things we're doing that really don't factor in this idea that people need relationships, that don't factor in the reality that people have experienced some really hard times that may be leading to some of this struggle. So that would be a starting place for me. And on a personal level, I tell every presentation I do, I say, I got one outcome I'm hoping for out of this conversation. If you don't learn a thing, if you don't know the parts of the brain, if you don't buy into relationships, I just ask people to just for one interaction, like when you get done with listening to this podcast, the next challenging interaction you have with anybody that frustrates you, makes you mad, or what, or you're like, this person's an idiot talking like this, whatever it is. I've been there like twice already today. Just stop. Just stop for a minute, pause, even just 5 seconds, and take that time and wonder, has this person experienced something in their life that may be the foundation of, or at least contributing to, this thing they're doing right now, this thing that they're saying, this thing that they're making me feel uncomfortable with? That they experience something that maybe is influencing this more than me, right? Maybe this isn't personal. And I think if you just incorporate that exercise, and I kind of do it with, I try to do it with everybody now. I mean, I walk around like, oh, I wonder what his story is. Wonder what her story is. Wonder what. And the beautiful thing is, when you start collecting these stories of people, one, you learn a lot. Like I learned a lot from those kids, and I'm fascinated by people's stories today. So one, you get smarter, and it's fun being smarter. Two, you suddenly don't have the relationship strains that you once had in your life. And you come to realize, oh, wait a minute. A lot of the relationship struggles weren't a them thing. It's been a me thing. And those are really powerful things to come to. And they really can come from just starting with, just stopping just for a few seconds in a conversation and just wondering. And the science will tell you that there's a really good chance they've been through something really, really hard. For me, I've discovered just the wondering piece starts to build some feelings of empathy. And you don't even have to know what it is to start being a little more empathetic. And like you said, and I think we've agreed that empathy would be a nice kind of common, cool thread for us all. If we had no other common thread in our lives, maybe empathy would be a great one, because empathy says we're all just fighting to know what's happened to each other, and not fighting to tell you what's happened to me, and all the things I need you to do and be different. So,
well, my challenge that I will tack on to Keith's challenge is to apply some of these same pauses and moments of reflection to ourselves. And I know we've spent time talking about the importance of looking outward, but also if you're experiencing a moment of frustration with yourself in your day, or you mess something up for the 6th time today, it might be worth taking a second to say, why did I feel frazzled? Why did that mistake happen? Perhaps it's because I'm living through a global pandemic. And I've never done that before. And I'm trying to care for my family and work a job and maintain relationships. So as much as it applies to other people, we're also worth that pause and consideration. I don't know if we are reminded of that enough.
No, and I'm glad you said it. We're always going to have a really hard time offering grace to somebody else if we can't give it to ourselves. So I'm glad that you added that in there.
So that's the Keith and Casey challenge to all who are listening.
Gonna be a lot of people out there pausing.
A lot of pauses. That's all we're asking for. Okay, Keith, so we have come to the end of our time, and I'm going to ask you the question that we ask all of our guests, which is, what does the process of awareness to action mean to you?
I read, you shared that question with me, and I kind of got, a little emotional. I do now thinking about it, because again, I go back to, I walked out of that training knowing that I had heard something that changed my life. And I walked out of there really overwhelmed by the reality of just the kind of hardship people have faced in their lives and the impact that it's having on them. And it's an awareness you have to act on when it's all you start thinking about. When you wake up in the middle of the night thinking about it. Like, I got friends that say, Keith, do you ever talk about anything other than people's stories and what happened to them as babies? And the answer is probably not much, But I think it's a beautiful thing when we become aware of something, and it moves us so much that we can't be us if we're not doing something about it. And so not everybody will hear this podcast, and that won't be you, and this is sort of off topic a little bit, but I just encourage you, if you become aware of anything today, tomorrow, and it just stirs in you, man, go do something about it. Because like I get goosebumps sitting here right now thinking, like I heard that I was in that conference, 4 years ago, and now I'm sitting here talking to you, right? I mean, that's like, that floors me in a way, because it wouldn't have happened. Like if I hadn't become aware of something that I refuse not to act on. And that would have been the consequence. This conversation you and I are having, this Casey and Keith challenge for people, like, sometimes we don't take enough time to sort of back up and see where that came from. And where it came from was awareness to an action. And I'm not the only one capable of that. And you're not the only one capable of saying, I think a podcast has helped. We're going to do one. A lot of people in our communities have the capacity to be aware of things, to look in that family's house and say, okay, now I'm aware of this. What can I contribute to giving them a chance? So I think it's certainly one of the more beautiful questions I've ever been asked doing some of these interviews and podcasts. And I hope people will take it to heart, because it's an us thing, so.
Beautifully said. I'm thinking that should just be the advertisement for this podcast. Awareness to action. That was really amazing summary. So thank you for that, Keith. And thank you for being here, for sharing your experiences and your heart with us. I have so enjoyed this conversation, and hopefully our listeners are feeling the same way right now.
Yeah, me too. I've been fired up since we first talked about doing it. I say yes to anything ACES. I keep telling folks that, because I truly believe it's like, when you become aware of something you believe is, at least an answer, if not the answer to a lot of things, you get excited. And then meeting you and kind of how fired up you are about doing this sort of stuff, it's like, okay, this is going to be a really cool thing to do. And I was right.
Well, thanks for being here. We were happy to have you on the podcast.
All right, Casey, thank you.
Thanks for listening. We've linked the resources that Keith mentioned in the episode description for those of you who are eager to learn more. We've also linked registration for upcoming ACES trainings in our area. If you're interested in impacting your community through an ACES lens, these virtual trainings are for you. As always, make sure to subscribe to Awareness to Action so you can keep up to date with all of our future episodes. We'll see you next time.